Hello everyone. Welcome back to Easy Listening English. Improve your listening skills, expand your vocabulary, and speak English more naturally with each lesson. Let's get started. I'm Linda, and today I want to share something that completely changed the way I speak English. A few years ago, I thought my English was pretty good. I knew a lot of grammar rules, I had memorized hundreds of vocabulary words, and I could easily pass written exams. However, whenever I listened to native speakers, I felt confused. They seemed to be speaking a different version of English. The words I learned from textbooks often sounded completely different when Americans used them in real conversations. At first, I thought the problem was my listening ability. I believed they were simply speaking too fast. But after spending more time around native speakers, I discovered something interesting. The issue was not only speed. The real difference was that native speakers constantly reduce and connect sounds together. They do not pronounce every word clearly and separately the way many English learners do. I remember my first week working at a marketing company in Chicago. During a team meeting, my manager asked everyone about their plans for the next project. One by one, my coworkers shared their ideas. Then a colleague named Jake said something that sounded like, "I'm going to call the client tomorrow." I understood the general meaning from the context, but I was puzzled. What exactly was gonna? Was it a new vocabulary word? Was it some kind of business slang? I quickly wrote it down in my notebook. Later that evening, I searched for it online. That was the moment I learned that gonna is simply the reduced form of going to. It felt almost funny. I had known the phrase going to for years, but I had never realized how commonly it changes during natural speech. After that discovery, I started paying closer attention. Suddenly, I heard gonna everywhere. People used it at work. They used it in restaurants. They used it at the gym. They used it while talking on the phone. They used it in movies, podcasts, and television shows. The more I listened, the more I realized that Americans rarely pronounce going to fully during casual conversations. Instead, they naturally blend the sounds together and say gonna. It saves time, it feels smoother, and it allows conversations to flow naturally. Once I understood this pattern, my listening skills improved dramatically. I stopped trying to separate every word. One morning, I arrived at work early and stopped by a coffee shop near the office. While waiting in line, I overheard two friends talking. One of them said, "I'm going to start exercising again next week." The other replied, "That's great. I'm going to join a yoga class." The conversation sounded effortless. Nobody paused to carefully pronounce each word. Everything flowed together naturally. As I listened, I realized that the reduction itself created a relaxed atmosphere. If they had said, "I am going to start exercising again next week," it would have sounded much more formal. It would still be correct English, of course, but it would not match the casual mood of the conversation. That day, I decided to practice using gonna myself. It felt strange at first. For years, teachers had encouraged me to pronounce every word carefully. Now, I was intentionally shortening words. During lunch, a coworker asked me what I planned to do over the weekend. Normally, I would have replied, "I am going to visit my parents." Instead, I took a deep breath and said, "I'm going to visit my parents." The sentence immediately felt more natural. My coworker smiled and continued the conversation without hesitation. It was a small moment, but it gave me confidence. I realized that speaking naturally is not about using complicated vocabulary. Sometimes, it is simply about sounding comfortable and connected. As the weeks passed, I found more opportunities to use gonna. When discussing future plans, I would say things like, "I'm going to finish this report tonight." Or, "We're going to meet the client next Thursday." Or even, "It's going to rain later." Every time I used the phrase, it became easier. Eventually, it stopped feeling like a special expression. It became part of my normal English. That is exactly how language learning should work. A useful phrase should not remain something you consciously remember. It should become something your brain automatically produces. One of the biggest mistakes English learners make is assuming that reductions are lazy speech. In reality, reductions are an important feature of fluent communication. Native speakers are not trying to break grammar rules. They are simply optimizing the way they communicate. Human beings naturally look for efficiency. We do it in every language. We shorten phrases, combine sounds, and create shortcuts. English is no different. In fact, understanding reductions often matters more than memorizing advanced vocabulary. You can know thousands of difficult words, but if you cannot recognize common reductions, everyday conversations may still feel challenging. I remember attending a networking event after work. The room was crowded, and people were introducing themselves quickly. During one conversation, a woman asked me about my career goals. I replied, "I'm going to focus on digital marketing this year." She immediately understood and asked several follow-up questions. Later, another person joined our discussion and said, "We're going to expand our business into new markets." Once again, the phrase appeared naturally. Nobody was thinking about grammar. Nobody was analyzing sentence structures. Everyone was simply communicating their plans and intentions. That experience taught me an important lesson. Real-world English is often much simpler than learners expect. Another interesting thing about gonna is the emotional effect it creates. When someone says, "I'm gonna help you," it often sounds warmer than the more formal version. When a friend says, "We're gonna have a great time," it sounds enthusiastic and friendly. The reduction creates a sense of closeness. It makes conversations feel less scripted. That emotional connection is one reason native speakers rely on it so frequently. Language is not only about transferring information. It is also about building relationships. Small pronunciation choices can influence how people perceive you. Over time, I developed a simple practice routine. Every morning, I would create 5 sentences using gonna. Sometimes they were about work. Sometimes they were about personal goals. Sometimes they were completely imaginary. For example, I might say, "I'm going to learn something new today." Or, "I'm going to cook dinner tonight." Or, "I'm going to travel somewhere exciting next year." The goal was not perfection. The goal was repetition. By repeating the pattern regularly, I trained my mouth and ears to recognize it automatically. One evening, I was watching an interview with a successful entrepreneur. Throughout the conversation, he repeatedly used gonna. He said things like, "We're going to launch a new product," and "We're going to hire more employees," and "It's going to be an exciting year." The interview reminded me that reductions are not limited to informal settings. Even highly educated professionals use them during natural speech. Fluency is not about sounding robotic. Fluency is about sounding comfortable, clear, and authentic. As my confidence grew, I started helping other English learners. Many of them faced the same challenge I once had. They could understand written English, but spoken English felt overwhelming. Whenever I introduced the concept of reductions, their faces lit up with understanding. Suddenly, movies became easier to follow. Podcasts became less intimidating. Conversations became more predictable. They realized that native speakers were not speaking mysterious English. They were simply connecting sounds in ways that textbooks often fail to emphasize. One day, a friend asked me for the single most important tip for improving listening skills. My answer surprised her. I did not recommend a grammar book. I did not recommend memorizing vocabulary lists. Instead, I told her to focus on common reductions like gonna. Once you recognize these patterns, spoken English starts making much more sense. You begin hearing phrases instead of isolated words. Your brain processes information faster. Communication becomes smoother and more enjoyable. Today, whenever I hear someone say going to very carefully in every casual conversation, I immediately recognize the sound of a learner who is still developing fluency. There is nothing wrong with that. Every learner starts somewhere. But I also know that a small shift can make a huge difference. Replacing going to with gonna in appropriate situations helps bridge the gap between classroom English and real-world English. It helps learners sound more natural and understand others more easily. And once you become comfortable using gonna to talk about what you will do in the future, something interesting begins to happen. Your conversations become more interactive. Instead of focusing only on your own plans, you start becoming curious about the plans of other people. You stop saying only what you're going to do, and you begin asking what someone else wants to do. You start making invitations. You start suggesting activities. You start building connections. And that is exactly where another incredibly useful American reduction enters the picture. Because when native speakers want to talk about desire, interest, or shared plans, they often do not say want to. They use a much smoother expression that appears constantly in everyday conversation. And once you hear it, you will start noticing it absolutely everywhere. There was a period in my life when I realized that speaking English was not really my biggest challenge. The bigger challenge was starting conversations. I could answer questions. I could explain my opinions. I could even give presentations at work. But whenever I wanted to approach someone first, invite someone somewhere, or suggest an activity, I often hesitated. I worried about sounding awkward. I worried about choosing the wrong words. I worried that my invitation might sound too formal or too direct. Then I started noticing a simple word that native speakers used constantly. That word was wanna. The first time I paid attention to it was during a lunch break at work. I was sitting with a few coworkers when one of them looked at another and casually said, "You want to grab some coffee after this?" The sentence sounded so smooth and effortless. There was nothing complicated about it. It did not sound like a carefully planned invitation. It sounded natural, friendly, and relaxed. The other coworker smiled and replied, "Sure, I'd love to." The entire exchange lasted only a few seconds, yet it created a connection between two people. That was when I began to understand that communication is not always about sharing information. Sometimes it is simply about opening a door. Over the following weeks, I started hearing wanna everywhere. Friends used it when making plans. Colleagues used it during brainstorming sessions. People used it while shopping, while walking their dogs, while ordering food, and while chatting on the phone. One afternoon I was waiting for a train when I overheard two students talking nearby. One of them asked, "You want to study at the library later?" The other answered, "Yeah, I want to finish this project tonight." It sounded completely normal. Nobody seemed to think twice about it. The phrase flowed naturally as part of everyday life. At first, I was reluctant to use it myself. Like many learners, I had spent years practicing the full form, want to. Whenever I spoke English, I automatically said things like, "Do you want to go?" Or "I want to try that restaurant." There was absolutely nothing wrong with those sentences. They were grammatically correct. But compared to the conversations I heard around me, they felt slightly more formal. Native speakers often blended the sounds together. Instead of saying want to, they simply said wanna. Once I understood this pattern, I decided to give it a try. A few days later, I was working on a project with a colleague named Sarah. We had been staring at spreadsheets for nearly 3 hours. The numbers were starting to blur together. Finally, I looked at her and said, "You want to take a quick break?" The words came out naturally. I did not overthink them. Sarah immediately smiled and said, "Absolutely." We walked downstairs, bought some coffee, and spent 10 minutes talking about movies instead of work. It was such a small interaction, yet it taught me something important. The phrase itself was simple, but it made initiating conversation feel easier. As I became more comfortable with wanna, I started using it in different situations. Sometimes I used it to suggest activities. Sometimes I used it to ask for opinions. Sometimes I used it to explore possibilities. For example, when friends visited my apartment, I might ask, "You want to order pizza?" During a weekend trip, I might say, "You want to check out that museum?" During a meeting, I might suggest, "You want to try a different approach?" Each time, the phrase helped keep the conversation casual and inviting. It encouraged participation rather than pressure. One thing I particularly liked about wanna was its flexibility. It could be playful. It could be friendly. It could be professional in the right setting. Imagine sitting with friends on a Friday evening and asking, "You want to watch a movie?" The sentence feels warm and relaxed. Now imagine a team meeting where someone says, "You want to hear an idea?" The phrase still works. It remains conversational without sounding careless. That balance is one reason Americans use it so often. I remember attending a networking event one evening. Large networking events used to make me nervous because they required me to approach strangers. I never knew how to begin conversations. That night, however, I decided to keep things simple. Instead of preparing complicated introductions, I focused on being curious. When I met a graphic designer, I asked, "You want to tell me about the projects you're working on?" When I met a startup founder, I asked, "You want to share how you got started?" The reactions were surprisingly positive. People enjoyed talking about themselves, and the casual phrasing made the conversations feel more personal. The more I listened, the more I noticed that wanna often appears when people are creating opportunities together. It is not only about desires. It is about connection. When someone asks, "You want to come with us?" they are inviting you into an experience. When someone says, "I want to learn more," they are expressing curiosity. When someone says, "We want to improve this process," they are creating a shared goal. The phrase frequently appears at the beginning of collaboration. One rainy afternoon, I was sitting in a cafe near my office. The weather outside was gloomy, and most people seemed eager to get home. At a nearby table, two entrepreneurs were discussing a business idea. One of them leaned forward and said, "I want to build something that actually helps people." The other nodded and replied, "I want to be part of that." Their conversation stayed in my mind long after I left the cafe. There was passion in those words. There was ambition. There was purpose. Yet the language remained simple. Sometimes the most powerful messages do not require complicated vocabulary. As my confidence improved, I began paying attention to pronunciation. Native speakers rarely pause between want and to. Instead, the sounds blend together. The result is smooth and rhythmic. When learners pronounce every syllable separately, conversations can sound more rigid. Practicing wanna helped me develop a more natural rhythm. It taught me to think in phrases rather than individual words. That shift improved both my speaking and listening abilities. I often recommend a simple exercise. Imagine 10 situations from your daily life. Then create a wanna sentence for each one. For example, I want to read more books this year. I want to improve my fitness. You want to grab lunch tomorrow? You want to see this photo? We want to finish the project early. Repeating these patterns trains your brain to use them automatically. Eventually, they become part of your natural speech. One of my favorite memories involving this phrase happened during a road trip with friends. We were driving through several small towns, stopping whenever something interesting caught our attention. Nobody had a strict schedule. The entire day was built around spontaneous decisions. Every few minutes, someone would ask, "You want to stop here?" Or, "You want to take a picture?" Or, "You want to try that restaurant?" The phrase became the soundtrack of the trip. It represented freedom, curiosity, and shared experiences. Looking back, I realized that many of life's best moments begin with a simple invitation. At work, I also noticed how effective one could be during collaboration. Instead of giving commands, people often frame suggestions as invitations. Rather than saying, "Do this," someone might say, "You want to take a look at this?" Instead of saying, "Present your idea," they might say, "You want to walk us through your thinking?" The wording felt less demanding and more cooperative. It encouraged discussion instead of creating pressure. Over time, I stopped translating from my native language before speaking. That was a major breakthrough. Instead of mentally constructing perfect sentences, I focused on communicating naturally. If I wanted to invite someone somewhere, wanna often appeared automatically. If I wanted to suggest an idea, the phrase emerged without effort. That is when language starts becoming a real tool rather than an academic subject. One morning, our company organized a volunteer event. Employees from different departments gathered in a large community center. Many of us had never met before. People were introducing themselves, moving chairs, preparing materials, and forming small groups. The room buzzed with energy. Everywhere I looked, conversations were beginning. Someone asked, "You want to help with registration?" Another person said, "You want to join our group?" The atmosphere felt welcoming because everyone was constantly inviting others to participate. As more people arrived, the room became louder and more crowded. Small conversations merged into larger discussions. New faces appeared every few minutes. Friends introduced friends. Team leaders greeted entire groups at once. Standing near the entrance, I watched someone step forward confidently and address several people together. The way they spoke instantly captured everyone's attention. Instead of focusing on a single individual, they spoke to the whole group as if everyone already belonged there. Within seconds, the room felt more connected, more united, and more energized. The moment I heard that speaker address the crowd, something immediately caught my attention. Instead of saying, "How are you guys doing?" or repeatedly using the word "you," he smiled, opened his arms, and said, "How are y'all doing today?" The response was instant. People smiled. A few laughed. Several answered at the same time. The room suddenly felt warmer. It was such a small detail, yet it completely changed the atmosphere. I had heard the word before in movies and television shows, but this was the first time I experienced its effect in real life. There was something inviting about it. Something that made a group of strangers feel less like individuals standing apart and more like a team sharing the same space. For the rest of the morning, I paid close attention whenever people spoke to larger groups. Interestingly, the word appeared again and again. One volunteer coordinator walked into a room carrying a box of supplies and said, "Morning, y'all." Another person asked, "Can y'all help me move these tables?" Nobody seemed surprised by the word. Nobody paused to think about it. It flowed naturally through conversations. That was when I realized that y'all is much more than a regional expression. It is a practical communication tool. It solves a problem that standard English never really solved perfectly. When I first learned English, I always found it strange that the word "you" could refer to one person or 20 people. Sometimes context made the meaning clear. Other times it created confusion. Imagine standing in a crowded room and saying, "Can you help me?" Several people might wonder whether you're talking to them. But if you say, "Can y'all help me?" the message becomes clear immediately. Everyone understands that the request is directed toward the entire group. It is simple, efficient, and surprisingly effective. A few weeks after that volunteer event, I traveled to Texas for a business conference. Before the trip, several friends joked that I would hear the word "y'all" every 5 minutes. They were not exaggerating. From the moment I landed at the airport, the expression seemed to be everywhere. The hotel receptionist greeted guests with, "How are y'all doing today?" Restaurant servers asked, "What can I get y'all?" Even signs in local shops occasionally included the word. Far from sounding unprofessional, it felt friendly and welcoming. People used it naturally because it reflected the culture around them. One evening during the conference, I attended a networking reception. The event took place on a rooftop overlooking the city skyline. As the sun began to set, groups of professionals gathered around small tables, introducing themselves and exchanging ideas. At one point, a speaker stepped onto a small stage to make announcements. Instead of launching directly into business topics, he smiled and said, "I hope y'all are having a great evening." The crowd immediately responded with enthusiasm. That opening sentence created a sense of connection before any serious discussion even began. What fascinated me most was how the word carried emotional weight. Technically, y'all simply means you all. Yet its impact goes beyond grammar. It communicates inclusion. It tells listeners that they belong to the conversation. When someone says, "I'm glad y'all are here," it feels personal. It feels warm. The speaker is acknowledging everyone at once while still making each individual feel recognized. That balance is one reason the expression remains so popular. As I spent more time listening to native speakers, I noticed that y'all appeared in countless situations. Teachers used it when addressing students. Coaches used it when motivating athletes. Managers used it during team meetings. Friends used it at social gatherings. Families used it around the dinner table. The expression adapted easily to different environments. Sometimes it sounded energetic. Sometimes it sounded affectionate. Sometimes it sounded humorous. Yet it always carried the same underlying message of togetherness. I decided to experiment with it myself. At first, I felt slightly hesitant. Like many learners, I worried about using slang incorrectly. However, one afternoon at work, an opportunity presented itself. Several coworkers and I were preparing for a presentation. We had been working together for weeks, and everyone was focused on final details. As we gathered around a conference table, I smiled and said, "Are y'all ready?" The reaction was immediate. A few people laughed, not because the phrase sounded strange, but because they appreciated the friendly energy behind it. The atmosphere relaxed instantly. What could have been a stressful moment suddenly felt more collaborative. That experience encouraged me to pay closer attention to how language influences group dynamics. Certain words create distance. Other words create connection. Y'all belongs firmly in the second category. It invites participation. It reduces formality without sacrificing clarity. Most importantly, it helps speakers establish rapport quickly. In many situations, building rapport is just as important as sharing information. One Saturday, I attended a community festival organized by local businesses and volunteers. The event featured live music, food trucks, and various activities for families. Throughout the day, I heard countless examples of people using y'all. A musician stepped onto the stage and called out, "How's everybody doing, y'all?" A food vendor greeted customers with, "What can I get y'all today?" A volunteer directing traffic smiled and said, "Thank y'all for coming." Every interaction felt welcoming. Even people who had never met before seemed comfortable speaking with one another. As the afternoon continued, I found myself reflecting on an important lesson. Many learners believe fluency comes from mastering complex grammar structures. While grammar certainly matters, communication often depends on something much simpler. It depends on making people feel comfortable. Native speakers understand this instinctively. They choose expressions that encourage connection. They use language not only to exchange information, but also to create a positive atmosphere. Y'all is a perfect example of that principle. Months later, I was asked to help lead a workshop for new employees at my company. Around 30 people attended. Some were recent graduates. Others had years of experience. Most of them looked slightly nervous. Starting a new job can be intimidating. As I stood at the front of the room, I remembered the speakers I had observed over the years. Rather than opening with a formal statement, I smiled and said, "I'm really happy y'all are here today." Immediately, I saw shoulders relax. A few people smiled back. The room felt more human, more approachable, more connected. That moment reinforced something I had learned through experience. Effective communication is not always about sounding impressive. Sometimes it is about sounding genuine. People rarely remember every detail of a presentation. They rarely remember every statistic or every slide. What they often remember is how the speaker made them feel. A simple word can contribute more to that feeling than an elaborate speech. One of the reasons I enjoy studying spoken English is that it reveals the relationship between language and culture. Certain expressions survive because they serve a purpose. Y'all survives because it fills a need. It allows speakers to address groups efficiently while maintaining warmth and friendliness. It transforms a collection of individuals into a shared audience. It creates a sense of belonging. Those qualities explain why the expression continues to spread beyond the regions where it originally became popular. During another conference several months later, I witnessed a perfect example of this effect. Hundreds of attendees filled a large auditorium. The event organizers had spent months preparing. Everyone was eager to hear the keynote speaker. When he finally walked onto the stage, the audience erupted into applause. He waited for the room to settle, looked around with a broad smile, and said, "I can't tell y'all how excited I am to be here today." The crowd responded immediately. The atmosphere became electric. People leaned forward in their seats. They were ready to listen. The presentation that followed was filled with inspiring ideas about innovation, leadership, and teamwork. Yet what stayed with me most was not a specific statistic or business strategy. It was the speaker's ability to connect with hundreds of people in a matter of seconds. Throughout his talk, he continued using inclusive language. He treated the audience as participants rather than spectators. The result was remarkable. People remained engaged from beginning to end. Near the conclusion of his presentation, he shared a story about a small startup that overcame enormous challenges. The founders had faced rejection after rejection. Investors doubted them. Competitors dismissed them. Yet they continued refining their idea until they achieved extraordinary success. As the speaker described the final breakthrough, excitement spread through the room. Heads nodded. Smiles appeared. Energy levels rose noticeably. Then he paused dramatically and revealed the outcome. The startup solution exceeded every expectation. Customers loved it. Industry experts praised it. Growth exploded far beyond projections. For a brief moment, the room fell silent. People looked at one another in disbelief. Then someone near the front row shook his head, laughed, and said loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "That's awesome." The reaction spread almost instantly. More smiles appeared. Several audience members repeated the word themselves. It perfectly captured the feeling in the room. The story had moved beyond being merely interesting. It had become genuinely inspiring. I smiled when I heard that reaction because it perfectly captured something I had been noticing for years. There are certain words in English that seem to appear everywhere, regardless of age, profession, or location. Awesome is one of those words. The more time I spent around native speakers, the more I realized that Americans use it for far more than its dictionary definition. Technically, the word describes something that inspires awe, something remarkable enough to leave people deeply impressed. In reality, however, native speakers use it in situations both big and small. They use it when discussing life-changing achievements. They use it when complimenting a simple lunch. They use it after hearing good news. They use it after solving a small problem. The word has become a powerful tool for expressing positivity. I first became aware of how common awesome was during my first year living in the United States. At the time, I expected compliments to sound more formal. I imagined people saying things like, excellent work, or that is very impressive. Instead, I kept hearing the same word. One morning I submitted a report to my manager. He reviewed it quickly, looked up, and said, awesome job. The compliment lasted only 2 words, yet it immediately made me feel appreciated. Later that same day, a coworker brought homemade cookies to the office. After tasting one, another colleague smiled and said, these are awesome. The situations were completely different, but the same expression fit both perfectly. As I continued listening, I noticed that tone of voice played an important role. The word itself was simple, but the way people pronounced it carried emotional meaning. Sometimes someone would say, awesome, with excitement and energy. Other times they would stretch the first syllable slightly and say, aweesome, to emphasize genuine enthusiasm. In a professional setting, someone might simply nod and say, awesome, to acknowledge that everything was moving in the right direction. The pronunciation changed, but the underlying message remained positive. One afternoon, I met a friend named Rachel for coffee after work. She had recently completed a difficult certification program that required months of studying. As soon as we sat down, she showed me the email confirming she had passed the final exam. Without even thinking, I responded, that's awesome. The word came naturally. It expressed happiness for her success without sounding exaggerated. Rachel immediately smiled. The reaction reminded me that communication is not only about choosing correct words. It is also about sharing emotions effectively. Over time, I started paying closer attention to situations where native speakers use compliments. I discovered that Americans often prefer positive reinforcement. Whether in schools, workplaces, sports teams, or social gatherings, people frequently acknowledge effort and progress. The word awesome appears repeatedly because it allows speakers to encourage others quickly and sincerely. A teacher might tell a student, awesome work on your project. A coach might say, awesome effort today. A friend might say, awesome idea. Each use strengthens relationships by creating a positive atmosphere. One Saturday morning, I joined a community cleanup event in a local park. Volunteers spent several hours collecting trash, planting flowers, and improving walking paths. By the end of the event, everyone was tired but proud of what they had accomplished. As people gathered for a group photo, one organizer looked around at the results and said, y'all did an awesome job today. The volunteers immediately smiled. Some applauded. Others exchanged high fives. The compliment recognized everyone's effort while boosting group morale. It was a perfect example of how a single word can influence the energy of an entire crowd. As my understanding grew, I began using the expression more confidently myself. Whenever coworkers contributed helpful ideas during meetings, I would say, that's awesome. When friends shared good news, I would respond the same way. The phrase felt natural because it was versatile. It could express admiration, approval, excitement, encouragement, or gratitude. Few words manage to serve so many purposes so effectively. One of my favorite examples occurred during a team brainstorming session. Our department had been struggling with a customer service issue for weeks. Several solutions had been proposed, but none seemed practical. Then a quiet employee named Marcus raised his hand and suggested a simple adjustment to our workflow. The room fell silent for a moment as people considered the idea. Suddenly, several team members began nodding. Questions were asked. Details were discussed. Within minutes, everyone realized that Marcus had identified a solution nobody else had considered. The manager leaned back in his chair, smiled broadly, and said, "That's awesome." The room immediately relaxed. The compliment validated the idea while encouraging further discussion. Experiences like that taught me an important lesson. Genuine compliments create momentum. When people feel appreciated, they become more willing to participate. They become more willing to share ideas, take risks, and contribute creatively. Positive language encourages positive behavior. That principle applies not only to workplaces, but also to friendships, families, and communities. Several months later, I attended a local art exhibition featuring emerging artists. The event was held in a renovated warehouse filled with paintings, sculptures, and photography displays. As visitors moved through the space, I repeatedly overheard the same reaction. People stopped in front of a piece they liked and simply said, "Awesome." Sometimes they said it quietly. Sometimes they said it enthusiastically. The expression communicated admiration without requiring a lengthy explanation. Everyone understood what it meant. One particular painting caught my attention. It depicted a city skyline reflected in a river at sunset. The colors were vibrant, yet the overall mood felt peaceful. As I stood there appreciating the artwork, an older man beside me shook his head slowly and said, "Wow, that's awesome." His reaction felt authentic. He was not trying to sound sophisticated. He was simply expressing genuine appreciation. That moment helped me understand why the word remains so popular. It feels honest. It allows people to share positive emotions without overcomplicating things. The more I listened to conversations, the more I noticed another interesting pattern. Native speakers often use awesome, not only to praise outcomes, but also to encourage future action. For example, if someone proposes a promising idea, another person might respond, "Awesome, let's do it." If a project reaches an important milestone, someone might say, "Awesome, keep going." The compliment becomes a source of motivation. It celebrates progress while encouraging continued effort. At work, I eventually developed a habit of using positive language intentionally. Whenever a colleague solved a problem, I acknowledged it. Whenever someone helped me, I expressed appreciation. Whenever a project moved forward successfully, I celebrated the achievement. The results were noticeable. Conversations became more collaborative. Team members became more supportive. People seemed more willing to help one another. Language influences culture, and culture influences performance. One evening, my friends and I organized a small dinner party. Everyone brought a dish to share. As people arrived, compliments filled the room. Someone tasted a homemade pasta dish and declared it awesome. Someone admired a dessert and called it awesome. Someone complimented the decorations and used the same word. At first glance, it might seem repetitive, yet nobody appeared bothered by it. The expression remained effective because it reflected genuine enjoyment. Authentic enthusiasm never feels stale. As the months passed, I became increasingly aware of how positivity shapes communication. Negative feedback certainly has its place. Constructive criticism is essential for growth. However, native speakers often balance criticism with encouragement. They recognize effort. They celebrate progress. They acknowledge contributions. Words like awesome help maintain that balance. They remind people that improvement is a journey rather than a constant evaluation. One particularly memorable experience occurred during a charity fundraising campaign. Our goal seemed ambitious. Many people doubted whether we could raise enough money before the deadline. Volunteers worked long hours organizing events, contacting donors, and promoting the cause. Week after week, progress was slow. Then, during the final days of the campaign, donations began increasing rapidly. The momentum became almost unbelievable. Every new update brought more excitement. On the final evening, organizers gathered everyone together to announce the results. The room was packed with volunteers, donors, and community members. Anticipation filled the air. Finally, the campaign director stepped onto the stage and revealed that we had exceeded the fundraising goal by a significant margin. The room erupted with applause. People cheered. Some hugged each other. Several volunteers looked genuinely emotional. The director smiled and simply said, "You all are awesome." The crowd responded even louder. It was one of those moments when a simple phrase carried tremendous meaning. That night, as I drove home, I reflected on the power of positive communication. A sincere compliment can inspire confidence. It can strengthen relationships. It can encourage effort. It can transform an ordinary interaction into a memorable one. Yet I also knew that life does not operate at maximum excitement all the time. Successes are often followed by challenges. Great ideas still require careful execution. High energy sometimes needs to be balanced with patience. Even during the most productive projects, there are moments when people move too quickly, overlook details, or become eager to rush ahead before everything is ready. A few weeks later, I found myself in the middle of one of those situations. Our team was preparing an important client presentation. Everyone was motivated. Everyone wanted the project to succeed. Ideas were flying across the room. People were speaking rapidly. Deadlines were approaching. The excitement was undeniable, but so was the risk of mistakes. As conversations became faster and faster, I noticed one colleague raise his hand slightly, smile, and calmly encourage everyone to slow down for just a moment while a final detail was checked. Almost immediately, the pace of the room shifted. The room had been buzzing with energy only seconds earlier. Ideas were bouncing from one person to another. Team members were discussing slides, reviewing numbers, checking timelines, and making last-minute adjustments before our client presentation. Everyone wanted everything to be perfect. The excitement was understandable because we had invested weeks of effort into the project. Yet, as often happens when people become enthusiastic, the pace started accelerating faster than the situation required. Several conversations overlapped. The questions were being asked before previous questions had been answered. Small details risked getting lost in the noise. Then one of my coworkers raised a hand, smiled calmly, and said, "Hang tight for a second." The effect was immediate. People stopped talking. The room settled down. Within moments, everyone was focused again. That was one of the first times I truly appreciated the power of that phrase. Before then, I had mostly associated waiting with expressions like, "wait a minute," or "hold on." Those phrases work perfectly well, of course. However, "hang tight" carries a slightly different feeling. It sounds friendly. It sounds reassuring. Most importantly, it communicates that the delay is temporary and purposeful. The speaker is not dismissing anyone. The speaker is simply asking for a little patience while something important is being handled. As I listened more carefully in daily life, I began noticing how frequently native speakers use this expression. One afternoon, I called a customer service department regarding a billing question. After explaining my situation, the representative said, "Hang tight while I pull up your account information." The phrase immediately reduced any potential frustration. I understood that she was actively working on the problem. I was not being ignored. I was simply being asked to wait briefly. A few days later, I experienced another example while shopping. I was standing at a checkout counter when the payment system suddenly stopped working. Several customers exchanged concerned looks. The cashier remained calm, smiled, and said, "Hang tight, folks. We're fixing the issue right now." The atmosphere relaxed almost instantly. Nobody became angry. Nobody started complaining. The phrase helped manage expectations. It reassured everyone that the problem was temporary and under control. That experience taught me something valuable about communication. Sometimes people are not upset because they have to wait. They become upset because they do not know what is happening. Uncertainty often creates more frustration than the delay itself. Expressions like "hang tight" provide information and reassurance at the same time. They acknowledge the inconvenience while offering confidence that progress is being made. One of the reasons I enjoy studying spoken English is that certain phrases reveal cultural attitudes. Americans generally value efficiency and action. When someone says "hang tight," they are usually implying that a solution is already in motion. The phrase suggests movement rather than stagnation. It tells listeners, "We are taking care of this. Please give us a moment." That subtle message makes a significant difference. I remember one particularly stressful morning at work when our company email system suddenly stopped functioning. Messages refused to send. Shared files became inaccessible. People were unable to communicate with clients. Understandably, frustration spread quickly through the office. Employees gathered around desks discussing possible causes. Some worried about missed deadlines. Others worried about customer reactions. Then a member of the IT team walked through the department and calmly said, "Hang tight, everyone. We're already working on it." Those few words changed the mood. The problem still existed, but people felt reassured. Confidence replaced panic. Over the years, I noticed that native speakers often use "hang tight" in situations involving customer service, teamwork, and problem-solving. It appears whenever patience is needed, but the speaker wants to maintain a positive tone. For example, if a restaurant is running behind schedule, a host might say, "Hang tight. Your table will be ready soon." If a teacher is organizing materials before a lesson, they might tell students, "Hang tight for a minute." If friends are coordinating plans and someone is running late, they may send a message saying, "Hang tight. I'll be there shortly." The phrase adapts easily to different contexts while preserving the same reassuring quality. One evening I experienced its usefulness firsthand. A group of friends and I had planned to attend an outdoor concert. We arrived early and found good spots near the stage. Unfortunately, just before the event was scheduled to begin, unexpected technical difficulties delayed the performance. Murmurs spread through the crowd. People checked their watches. Some wondered whether the concert would even happen. Then an event organizer stepped onto the stage and addressed the audience. He smiled and said, "Hang tight, everybody. We're almost ready to get started." The crowd responded positively. People relaxed because they knew what was happening. The phrase transformed uncertainty into patience. As I became more familiar with the expression, I started using it myself. At first, it felt slightly unusual because it was not part of my natural vocabulary. However, practice gradually changed that. One day a coworker asked me for information that I needed to locate in an old database. Instead of saying, "Wait," I responded, "Hang tight for a second while I find it." The phrase felt polite and professional. More importantly, it communicated respect. I was acknowledging the other person's time while explaining why the delay was necessary. The more I used the expression, the more I appreciated its versatility. It works in formal settings. It works in casual conversations. It works with customers, coworkers, friends, and family members. That flexibility is one reason it remains so common. Many expressions become limited to specific environments, but hang tight travels comfortably between different social situations. One weekend, I volunteered at a charity event where participants registered for a fundraising walk. Hundreds of people arrived within a short period of time. Registration lines quickly became longer than expected. Volunteers worked hard to process everyone efficiently, but delays were unavoidable. Throughout the morning, I repeatedly heard organizers telling participants to hang tight. The phrase helped maintain a positive atmosphere despite the inconvenience. People felt informed rather than ignored. Communication experts often emphasize the importance of managing expectations. The more experience I gained, the more I understood why. Expectations influence emotional reactions. If people expect immediate results and encounter delays, frustration increases. If they understand the reason for a delay and believe progress is being made, patience becomes easier. Hang tight serves as a simple tool for managing expectations effectively. Several months later, our department launched a major project involving multiple teams across different offices. Coordinating the effort was challenging. Meetings filled our calendars. Deadlines overlapped. Unexpected issues appeared almost daily. During one particularly complicated week, I noticed that successful managers frequently used reassuring language. Whenever problems emerged, they avoided creating panic. Instead, they acknowledged the issue and communicated a plan. Phrases like hang tight appeared regularly because they encouraged calm problem-solving rather than emotional reactions. One afternoon, a client requested an urgent revision to a proposal we had already finalized. The request arrived only hours before an important presentation. Team members immediately began making changes. Documents were updated. Data was rechecked. Graphics were adjusted. The situation felt chaotic. Yet throughout the process, our project manager remained remarkably calm. Whenever someone asked for an update, she simply said, hang tight. We're almost there. Her confidence helped the rest of us stay focused. Watching her handle pressure taught me another lesson. Effective communication is not only about the information being shared. It is also about emotional leadership. People often take emotional cues from those around them. A calm voice can reduce stress. A reassuring phrase can restore confidence. A few carefully chosen words can prevent small challenges from becoming larger problems. Outside of work, I notice similar patterns in everyday life. Parents use the phrase with children. Friends use it during travel. Coaches use it with athletes. Even strangers occasionally use it during unexpected situations. The expression survives because it solves a universal communication need. Human beings frequently encounter moments when progress pauses temporarily. During those moments, reassurance becomes valuable. One snowy winter evening, I was traveling home after visiting relatives. Bad weather caused significant delays at the airport. Departure times changed repeatedly. Passengers became increasingly restless. Some stood near service desks seeking information. Others checked their phones every few minutes. Eventually, an airline employee made an announcement over the loudspeaker. She explained the situation clearly and ended with a simple request for everyone to hang tight while crews worked to ensure safe conditions. The reaction was noticeably calmer than before. Clear communication reduced anxiety. Experiences like that reinforced an important truth. Waiting is often unavoidable. Delays happen. Technology fails. Weather changes. Plans shift unexpectedly. The difference between a manageable delay and a frustrating one often depends on communication. People generally respond better when they understand what is happening and believe someone is actively addressing the situation. As the years passed, hang tight became one of those expressions I no longer had to think about. It entered my vocabulary naturally because I encountered it so often. More importantly, I understood the mindset behind it. The phrase represents patience combined with confidence. It reminds listeners that temporary delays are simply part of the process. One particularly busy Friday afternoon, that lesson became especially relevant. Our team was preparing to send final materials to an important client before the weekend. Everyone had reviewed the documents multiple times. Deadlines were approaching. The atmosphere felt focused and optimistic. At last, the files were ready. Someone attached them to an email. Another person double-checked the recipient list. Everything appeared perfect. Then, just before the message was sent, one employee frowned slightly while reviewing the attachments. He asked everyone to hang tight for a moment because something did not look quite right. The room grew quiet as people leaned closer to their screens. A small oversight had just been discovered, and catching it at that exact moment would end up preventing a much larger problem. Everyone leaned closer to their screens as the issue became clear. The wrong attachment had been added to the email. Instead of the final version of the presentation, an earlier draft was sitting in the attachment field, complete with outdated numbers and incomplete notes. If the email had been sent only a few seconds earlier, the client would have received inaccurate information. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then the employee who had prepared the email looked up and sighed. He rubbed the back of his neck, gave a small embarrassed smile, and said, "My bad." The room immediately relaxed. There was no dramatic reaction. There was no blame. There was no attempt to make excuses. He simply acknowledged the mistake and moved on to fixing it. That was one of the things I admired most about the phrase. My bad is simple, direct, and surprisingly effective. Instead of wasting time defending yourself or searching for someone else to blame, you accept responsibility and focus on the solution. Native speakers use this expression constantly for small, everyday mistakes. It communicates accountability without turning a minor problem into a major event. The first time I heard the phrase, I did not completely understand it. I was having lunch with several coworkers when one of them accidentally knocked over a water bottle. A small amount of water spilled across the table. He quickly grabbed some napkins and said, "My bad." Everyone laughed lightly and continued eating. The incident lasted less than 30 seconds. At the time, I found it interesting that nobody said, "It was not my fault," or offered a lengthy explanation. The phrase itself was enough. It acknowledged the mistake and allowed everyone to move forward. As I became more familiar with American English, I started hearing "my bad" almost everywhere. Friends used it when they arrived late. Coworkers used it when they forgot an attachment. Students used it when they misunderstood instructions. Family members used it during everyday conversations. The phrase appeared repeatedly because human beings make small mistakes constantly. Instead of treating every error like a serious failure, native speakers often use light, casual language to keep situations in perspective. One afternoon, I experienced this firsthand. I had arranged to meet a friend at a coffee shop after work. We agreed on a specific location and time. Unfortunately, I became distracted during a busy afternoon and accidentally went to the wrong branch of the cafe. After waiting for several minutes, I checked my messages and realized my mistake. I immediately called my friend and said, "My bad, I'm at the wrong location." She laughed and told me not to worry. The situation was resolved within minutes. The phrase helped communicate responsibility without creating unnecessary drama. What makes "my bad" so useful is that it strikes a balance. It acknowledges responsibility while maintaining a relaxed tone. However, I also learned that context matters. The expression works best for minor mistakes. If you accidentally send the wrong document, arrive a few minutes late, forget someone's coffee order, or misunderstand a simple instruction, "My bad" is perfectly appropriate. On the other hand, serious situations often require a more formal apology. Understanding that distinction is an important part of effective communication. I remember attending a professional communication workshop where this topic came up indirectly. The instructor explained that people often make two opposite mistakes when handling errors. Some refuse to admit responsibility. Others over-apologize for every small issue. Neither approach is ideal. Refusing responsibility damages trust, while excessive apologizing can make minor situations feel larger than they really are. A phrase like, "my bad," works because it acknowledges reality accurately. It says, "I made a mistake, I recognize it, and I'm ready to move forward." That lesson stayed with me for years. In fact, the more experience I gained in professional environments, the more I appreciated people who could admit mistakes quickly. Every workplace experiences problems. Deadlines get missed. Information gets overlooked. Technology fails unexpectedly. What separates effective teams from ineffective ones is often how they respond when things go wrong. People who spend their energy hiding mistakes usually create larger problems. People who acknowledge mistakes early create opportunities for solutions. One particularly memorable example occurred during a major project involving several departments. Hundreds of documents needed to be organized before an important client review. Everything seemed to be progressing smoothly until one afternoon when a colleague discovered that a file had been saved in the wrong folder. As a result, several team members had been working from outdated information. The mistake caused confusion, but it was still fixable. The employee responsible immediately said, "My bad. I moved it to the wrong directory." Then he corrected the issue and helped everyone update their files. The problem was resolved within the hour because responsibility was accepted immediately. Experiences like that taught me that trust is built through honesty rather than perfection. Nobody expects human beings to be flawless. What people often expect is transparency. When someone openly admits a mistake, others usually respond with understanding. They recognize that errors are part of life. In many cases, admitting a mistake quickly actually strengthens credibility because it demonstrates integrity. I noticed this pattern outside of work as well. During recreational sports games, players constantly use the phrase, if someone missed an easy pass, they might smile and say, "My bad." If someone misunderstood a strategy, they might use the same expression. The phrase prevented frustration from escalating. Instead of dwelling on errors, people focused on enjoying the activity and improving their performance. One weekend, I joined a group of friends for a hiking trip. The route included several trails winding through a large state park. At one point, one of our friends accidentally led the group down the wrong path. We spent nearly 20 minutes walking before realizing the mistake. When someone pointed it out, he laughed and said, "My bad." Nobody became upset. In fact, several people joked that the wrong trail offered better scenery than the original one. What could have become an irritating situation turned into a funny memory simply because the mistake was acknowledged openly. The phrase also reveals something important about confidence. Many people assume that admitting mistakes makes them appear weak. In reality, the opposite is often true. Confident individuals usually have no problem acknowledging minor errors because their self-worth is not threatened by them. They understand that making mistakes is part of learning and growth. The ability to say, "my bad," comfortably often reflects emotional maturity rather than insecurity. As the years passed, I started using the phrase naturally. It became part of my everyday communication. If I interrupted someone accidentally during a conversation, I might say, "My bad." If I forgot to reply to a message promptly, I might use the same expression. The phrase felt efficient because it addressed the issue without turning attention away from the solution. One thing I particularly appreciate about spoken English is how often it rewards practicality. Many expressions exist because they solve common social challenges. Human beings occasionally make mistakes. Human beings occasionally inconvenience one another. Human beings occasionally misunderstand situations. Rather than creating complicated explanations every time something goes wrong, native speakers often rely on simple phrases that communicate responsibility quickly and clearly. A few months after the email incident, I witnessed another excellent example during a community volunteer project. Several teams were responsible for organizing supplies before a large event. Everything was moving smoothly until someone realized that a shipment had been delivered to the wrong building. Volunteers began searching for the missing materials. Eventually, one coordinator discovered that he had entered the incorrect address during the ordering process. He immediately smiled and said, "My bad, everyone." Then he organized transportation to retrieve the shipment. The issue was resolved faster because nobody wasted energy arguing about blame. Watching situations like that helped me understand why some groups function so effectively under pressure. Successful teams do not eliminate mistakes completely. That would be impossible. Instead, they create environments where mistakes can be acknowledged quickly and corrected efficiently. The phrase, "my bad," contributes to that culture by normalizing accountability. Of course, there are moments when a more serious apology is necessary. If someone's feelings are hurt, if trust is damaged, or if significant consequences occur, a deeper conversation may be required. Native speakers generally understand this distinction. They do not use "my bad" for every situation. Rather, they reserve it for everyday errors that can be resolved without extensive discussion. Learning that boundary is an important part of sounding natural and professional. One evening, I was reflecting on this topic while reviewing notes from several projects I had completed over the years. As I looked back, I realized that many of my most valuable lessons had emerged from mistakes. Some mistakes taught me to pay closer attention. Others taught me to communicate more clearly. Others taught me to prepare more carefully. Ironically, many successes were built on foundations created by earlier failures. The willingness to admit mistakes had accelerated learning rather than slowing it down. That realization became especially clear during a product launch our company organized several months later. The project involved dozens of employees working together toward a common goal. Along the way, numerous small mistakes occurred. Incorrect files appeared. Schedules changed unexpectedly. Details needed revision. Yet every challenge became an opportunity to improve the final result. Team members acknowledged problems quickly, corrected them efficiently, and continued moving forward. When launch day finally arrived, the outcome exceeded everyone's expectations. Customers responded enthusiastically. Feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Team members celebrated together after months of hard work. As I looked around the room, I found it fascinating that several of the people receiving praise were the same individuals who had openly admitted mistakes earlier in the project. Their willingness to acknowledge errors had not weakened their contributions. If anything, it had strengthened them. By facing problems directly, they had helped create something better than anyone originally imagined. Later that evening, as conversations continued and people shared stories from the project, someone mentioned one of the early mistakes that had nearly caused a delay. Everyone laughed about it now because the final outcome had been such a success. Looking back, it seemed almost unbelievable how far the project had come. What had started with small setbacks and minor frustrations had transformed into something impressive enough to leave people staring in genuine amazement, struggling to find words strong enough to describe just how remarkable the result truly was. There are moments in life when ordinary words no longer seem strong enough. You can say something is good. You can say it is impressive. You can even say it is amazing. Yet occasionally you encounter an experience so unexpected, so remarkable, and so memorable that none of those expressions fully capture what you feel. That is when many native speakers reach for the phrase blown away. The first time I truly understood this expression was not in a classroom or from a textbook. It happened during a real moment of genuine surprise. Several years ago, I attended a local talent competition organized by community organizations and small businesses. I had gone mainly to support a friend who was performing music that evening. The event itself seemed fairly ordinary at first. Families filled the audience. Performers chatted nervously backstage. Volunteers moved equipment around the venue. Everything felt friendly and relaxed. As the show progressed, I enjoyed the performances, but nothing stood out as extraordinary. Then a young pianist walked onto the stage. At first glance, there was nothing dramatic about his appearance. He looked calm, almost shy. He sat down at the piano, adjusted the bench slightly, and waited for the room to become quiet. When he began playing, the entire atmosphere changed. The notes seemed to fill every corner of the auditorium. Conversations stopped immediately. People who had been checking their phones looked up. Children became quiet. The audience listened with complete attention. By the time the performance ended, the room exploded with applause. I remember turning to the woman sitting beside me and saying, "I am completely blown away." It was the first phrase that came to mind because it perfectly described the feeling. I was not merely impressed. I was overwhelmed by admiration. The performance had exceeded every expectation I had before it began. That is the essence of being blown away. Something surprises you in the best possible way and leaves a lasting impression. As I continued living and working in English-speaking environments, I heard the phrase frequently. Native speakers use it whenever they encounter exceptional talent, extraordinary kindness, remarkable achievements, or unexpected excellence. The expression carries a stronger emotional impact than many other compliments because it suggests genuine amazement. It communicates that the experience moved beyond ordinary appreciation and entered the territory of unforgettable admiration. Most employees expected a typical corporate presentation filled with charts and statistics. Instead, the speaker delivered one of the most engaging talks I had ever heard. He told compelling stories. He connected complex ideas to everyday experiences. He made people laugh while teaching valuable lessons. When the presentation ended, I overheard several coworkers sharing their reactions. One employee shook his head and said, "I was blown away by that presentation." Everyone nearby nodded in agreement. What fascinated me was how naturally the phrase appeared whenever emotions became stronger than usual. Native speakers rarely use it for average experiences. Nobody says they were blown away by a routine email or an ordinary sandwich. The phrase is reserved for moments that genuinely exceed expectations. That selective use gives it power. When someone says they were blown away, listeners immediately understand that something exceptional occurred. I experienced another memorable example while traveling. During a vacation in the Pacific Northwest, I decided to visit a national park known for its mountain scenery. I had seen photographs online before arriving, so I thought I knew what to expect. The images were beautiful, but photographs can only capture so much. When I finally stood at a viewpoint overlooking snow-covered peaks stretching across the horizon, I felt speechless. The scale of the landscape was difficult to describe. The mountains seemed endless. The air felt impossibly fresh. Sunlight reflected from distant glaciers. For several moments, I simply stood there in silence. Later that evening, I called a friend to share the experience. As I searched for words, I found myself saying, "I was completely blown away." Again, the phrase felt perfect because ordinary adjectives seemed insufficient. Sometimes beauty affects people so deeply that language struggles to keep pace with emotion. Expressions like blown away help bridge that gap. Another reason I appreciate the phrase is that it often reflects authenticity. People generally do not use it casually unless they genuinely mean it. When someone tells you they were blown away by your work, your performance, or your kindness, the compliment carries weight. It suggests that you exceeded expectations significantly. That sincerity makes the phrase memorable. I remember a colleague named Emma who joined our company shortly after graduating from university. During her first few months, she worked quietly and rarely drew attention to herself. Then one day, she was asked to lead a presentation for a major client. Many people worried she might feel overwhelmed because of her limited experience. Instead, she delivered an outstanding presentation. Her preparation was thorough. Her communication was clear. Her confidence grew stronger with each slide. By the end, even senior managers were impressed. After the meeting, people gathered around her to offer congratulations. One manager smiled and said, "Honestly, I was blown away." Emma looked surprised, but also proud. The compliment meant more because it reflected genuine admiration rather than routine politeness. Everyone in the room knew that the praise was earned. The phrase is also common when discussing acts of kindness. Not every memorable experience involves talent or achievement. Sometimes what leaves us blown away is another person's generosity. A few years ago, a severe storm damaged several homes in a nearby community. Within days, volunteers began organizing support efforts. People donated supplies. Local businesses provided food. Neighbors helped repair damaged property. The response was incredible. One weekend, I joined a volunteer group helping families clean debris from their yards. What impressed me most was the number of strangers who appeared simply because they wanted to help. Some traveled from neighboring towns. Others used vacation days from work. Nobody expected recognition. They simply wanted to contribute. Watching hundreds of people work together for the benefit of others left a deep impression on me. When describing the experience later, I told friends that I was blown away by the generosity of the community. Moments like that remind me that admiration is not limited to professional success or artistic talent. Human kindness can be equally inspiring. Native speakers often use blown away to describe emotional experiences that restore faith in people. The phrase captures both surprise and appreciation at the same time. Over the years, I noticed that being blown away often creates motivation. When we witness excellence, we naturally feel inspired. Seeing exceptional effort encourages us to work harder. Observing remarkable creativity sparks new ideas. Experiencing extraordinary kindness motivates us to become kinder ourselves. Inspiration spreads through observation. That happened to me after attending a technology conference several years ago. One speaker demonstrated a product that solved a problem many people had considered impossible. The innovation itself was impressive, but what fascinated me even more was the persistence required to create it. The development process had taken years. Numerous failures occurred along the way. Yet the team continued refining the idea until they achieved success. I left the conference feeling energized. The presentation had not only informed me, it had inspired me. For weeks afterward, I approached my own projects with greater enthusiasm. That is another characteristic of experiences that leave us blown away. Their influence often lasts beyond the moment itself. They continue affecting our thoughts and actions long after the event ends. As I became more aware of this pattern, I started paying attention to what consistently impressed me. Sometimes it was exceptional skill. Sometimes it was courage. Sometimes it was perseverance. Sometimes it was generosity. Regardless of the specific source, the common element was always the same. Something exceeded my expectations dramatically enough to create a lasting emotional impact. One evening, I attended a charity gala where several individuals were recognized for community service. Throughout the event, speakers shared stories about volunteers who had dedicated years of their lives to helping others. Many of those stories were deeply moving. One volunteer in particular had spent decades mentoring disadvantaged students without seeking recognition. As his accomplishments were described, the audience grew increasingly emotional. By the end of the presentation, many people were wiping tears from their eyes. Walking out of the venue that night, I overheard countless conversations. Again and again, people used the same phrase. They said they were blown away by his dedication, blown away by his generosity, blown away by the impact he had made. The repetition did not diminish the expression. If anything, it reinforced how effectively it captured the collective feeling. The longer I studied spoken English, the more I realized that language often reflects human psychology. Expressions survive because they describe experiences people encounter repeatedly. Human beings regularly encounter moments of admiration. We witness achievements that exceed expectations. We meet individuals whose actions inspire us. We experience beauty that leaves us speechless. The phrase blown away exists because those moments are universal. At the same time, I learned another interesting lesson. Experiences that leave us blown away are often emotionally intense. They generate excitement, inspiration, and enthusiasm. Yet intense emotions can be surprisingly draining. After major events, important presentations, long projects, or unforgettable experiences, I sometimes noticed a different feeling emerging. The excitement remained, but my energy level began to drop. My mind felt inspired, yet my body felt tired. It was as though all that emotional investment required a period of recovery afterward. One particularly busy season at work illustrated this perfectly. After months of preparation, our team completed a series of successful projects in rapid succession. The results were outstanding. Clients were happy. Managers were impressed. Everyone felt proud of what had been accomplished. The positive energy seemed endless. Yet after several weeks of operating at that intensity, small signs of fatigue began appearing. People looked more tired than usual. Conversations became quieter. Energy levels fluctuated. Even I started noticing that I was not feeling quite like myself. Nothing seemed seriously wrong, but my body was clearly suggesting that it needed rest and a slower pace for a while. At first, I tried to ignore those signals. Like many people, I convinced myself that I simply needed another cup of coffee, another productive day, or another good night's sleep. After all, nothing serious seemed to be wrong. I was still going to work. I was still meeting deadlines. I was still exercising occasionally and keeping up with my responsibilities. Yet something felt different. My energy level was lower than usual. Getting out of bed in the morning required more effort. Small tasks that normally felt easy suddenly seemed a little heavier. It was not the kind of condition that would send someone to the hospital, but it was enough to remind me that my body was asking for attention. One Monday morning, I arrived at the office feeling unusually tired. A coworker looked at me and immediately asked if everything was okay. I smiled and said, "I'm just a little under the weather today." She nodded as though she understood perfectly. There was no need for a long explanation. I did not have to list every symptom or describe every detail. That simple expression communicated exactly what I wanted to say. I was not seriously ill, but I was not feeling 100% either. That was one of the reasons I came to appreciate the phrase, under the weather. Native speakers use it constantly because it fills a useful gap in communication. Sometimes you are healthy.
Sometimes you are seriously sick.
But there is also a large area in between. Maybe you have a mild cold. Maybe you have a headache. Maybe you are exhausted from several demanding weeks. Maybe your body simply feels off. In those situations, saying you are under the weather feels natural and accurate. The first time I heard the expression, I was actually confused. A friend canceled dinner plans and sent me a message saying she was feeling under the weather. I remember looking at the phrase and wondering what weather had to do with anything. Was it raining where she lived? Was there a storm? Had she been caught outside? Eventually, I learned that the expression has nothing to do with the current forecast. It is simply an idiom used to describe feeling slightly unwell. Once I understood the meaning, I started noticing it everywhere. Coworkers used it. Friends used it. Television characters used it. Even professional emails occasionally included the phrase. It appeared whenever people wanted to communicate that they were not feeling their best without turning the conversation into a medical discussion. That balance makes the expression especially useful. A few months later, I experienced a situation where the phrase helped me significantly. A friend invited me to a birthday celebration at a restaurant downtown. Normally, I would have loved to attend. However, the day before the event, I woke up with a sore throat and a mild fever. Nothing severe, but enough to leave me feeling tired and uncomfortable. I did not want to spread germs or spend the evening pretending to feel energetic. So I sent a message saying, "I'm sorry, but I'm feeling a bit under the weather today. I think I should stay home and rest." The response was immediate and understanding. Nobody pressured me to attend. Nobody demanded details. Everyone understood exactly what I meant. The phrase communicated the situation politely and efficiently. It allowed me to decline the invitation without sounding dramatic or overly personal. That experience taught me something important about communication. Not every conversation requires complete detail. Sometimes the goal is simply to provide enough information for the other person to understand your situation. Native speakers often use expressions like under the weather because they respect that balance. The phrase is honest without being excessive. I encountered a similar situation at work not long afterward. During a particularly busy season, several employees became sick with seasonal colds. One morning, a team member sent a message explaining that he would be working from home because he was feeling under the weather. The message was professional, concise, and clear. Everyone understood immediately. No lengthy explanation was necessary. The more I listened to how native speakers use the phrase, the more I realized that it often appears in professional environments precisely because it sounds polite. Imagine receiving a message that lists every symptom in great detail. Most people would probably feel uncomfortable. On the other hand, saying you are under the weather communicates the essential information while maintaining professionalism. There was a period when I traveled frequently for work. Airports, hotels, meetings, and changing schedules became part of my routine. While those trips were exciting, they were also exhausting. Occasionally, after several weeks on the road, I would notice signs that my body needed rest. I might develop a headache. My concentration might decrease slightly. My energy level might drop. During those times, I often described myself as feeling under the weather. The phrase captured the experience perfectly because I was not truly sick, yet I was certainly not operating at full strength. One winter, I learned another valuable lesson about listening to my body. I had spent several weeks pushing myself hard. Multiple projects were happening simultaneously. Deadlines were approaching. Meetings filled nearly every hour of my calendar. I kept telling myself that I would rest later. Eventually, my body made the decision for me. I woke up one morning feeling completely drained. Even simple activities required effort. Instead of forcing myself through another demanding day, I contacted my manager and explained that I was feeling under the weather. Then I spent the day resting. I drank tea, read a book, and allowed myself time to recover. By the following day, I already felt better. Looking back, I realized that taking a short break had prevented a longer problem. Sometimes productivity means knowing when to slow down. That lesson applies to language learning as well. Many learners believe they must study every waking hour to improve. While consistency is important, rest is equally important. The brain needs time to process new information. When we ignore signs of fatigue, progress often becomes slower rather than faster. Listening to our bodies allows us to perform better in the long run. Another reason I like the expression under the weather is that it encourages moderation. It acknowledges discomfort without exaggeration. In modern life, people sometimes swing between extremes. They either claim everything is perfect or act as though every minor inconvenience is a disaster. This idiom occupies the middle ground. It says, "I'm not feeling great right now, but I expect to recover." One evening, I was speaking with an older neighbor who seemed unusually quiet. Normally, he enjoyed chatting about gardening and local events. That day, however, he looked tired. When I asked how he was doing, he smiled and said, "Just a little under the weather." The phrase felt reassuring. It communicated honesty without creating concern. A few days later, he was back outside tending his garden as usual. As the years passed, I came to appreciate how often effective communication depends on subtlety. Native speakers do not always choose the most dramatic expression available. Instead, they often choose the expression that best matches reality. If someone is experiencing a minor illness, under the weather communicates that reality accurately. It avoids exaggeration while remaining truthful. One rainy weekend, I spent most of my time at home recovering from a mild cold. The weather outside matched my mood perfectly. Gray clouds covered the sky. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Normally, I enjoy staying busy, but that weekend forced me to slow down. I read several books, watched a few documentaries, and spent time reflecting on goals I had been too busy to consider recently. Interestingly, periods of rest often create opportunities for reflection. When life moves quickly, there is little time to think deeply. We focus on schedules, responsibilities, and deadlines. When we slow down, our minds finally have space to wander. Sometimes that wandering leads to creativity. Sometimes it leads to self-discovery. Sometimes it simply leads to random thoughts. As I rested on the couch that weekend, I noticed how quiet the house felt. Without meetings, conversations, or daily routines competing for attention, my thoughts became louder. I started thinking about projects at work. I wondered how certain decisions would turn out. I thought about conversations I had recently had with friends. I replayed small moments in my mind. Nothing seemed particularly important at first, but the longer I sat there, the more my imagination began filling empty spaces with questions. That is one of the strange things about spending too much time alone when you are not feeling your best. Physical discomfort can sometimes affect your mental perspective. A minor concern suddenly feels larger than it really is. A delayed response to a message becomes suspicious. A simple misunderstanding begins to seem more significant. When energy levels are low, the mind occasionally starts creating stories that may not even be true. I remember checking my phone several times that weekend and noticing that one colleague had not responded to a message. Under normal circumstances, I would not have thought much about it. People get busy. Messages are overlooked. Life happens. Yet sitting alone in a quiet house while feeling under the weather gave my imagination extra room to operate. For a brief moment, I found myself wondering whether there was something I did not know, whether conversations were happening without me, whether information was being kept quiet for some reason. The thoughts were probably unnecessary, but they appeared anyway, drifting through my mind as the rain continued falling outside the window. The more I sat there in silence, the more those thoughts kept circling in my mind. At first they were small, almost harmless, just brief questions that drifted in and out of consciousness. Then they became more persistent. I started wondering whether something important was happening at the office without me. I wondered whether a decision had already been made. I wondered whether people were discussing a problem that nobody had told me about yet. None of it was based on clear evidence, but that did not stop my imagination from building a story out of very little. That is what happens sometimes when a person is tired, uncomfortable, and alone with too much time to think. Small doubts can grow quickly, especially when the mind is looking for answers. By the next morning, I had mostly recovered physically, but the strange feeling of uncertainty remained in the back of my mind. When I returned to work, the atmosphere seemed normal on the surface. People were moving around, answering messages, and preparing for the day as usual. Still, I noticed a few subtle things. A colleague stopped talking when I walked past her desk. Another person gave me a look that seemed slightly guarded, though I could not tell why. I tried not to overthink it, but the quiet tension in the room made me curious. Something felt unfinished. Something felt hidden just beneath the surface. And once that feeling appears, it can be hard to ignore. During the morning meeting, our manager gave us a short update about an upcoming client presentation. He spoke calmly, but he seemed to choose his words very carefully. He mentioned that a few details were still being finalized, and then he quickly moved on to the next topic. No one asked any questions. The room remained unusually quiet. I remember looking around and noticing that several people seemed to already know more than they were saying. I could not prove it, but the atmosphere had changed. It felt like there was a piece of information floating somewhere in the room, just out of reach. That kind of tension can be strangely distracting because the mind naturally wants to fill in the blanks. Later that day, I was making tea in the office kitchen when I overheard two coworkers speaking softly near the storage shelves. They immediately lowered their voices when they noticed me, which only made me more curious. One of them smiled awkwardly and changed the subject. The other pretended to be busy reading a label on a box of paper cups. I did not press them for answers, but I definitely noticed the shift. That was the moment when I realized that there was something they were not saying directly. Maybe it was not serious. Maybe it was just a surprise. But whatever it was, the room seemed to be carrying a secret, and everybody was acting as though the secret were heavier than usual. A few hours later, I was sitting at my desk when my phone buzzed with a message from my friend Megan. The message simply said, "Call me when you have a minute." There was nothing unusual about those words by themselves. And yet, because my mind was already full of questions, I immediately wondered what she needed to tell me. Was something wrong? Was she upset? Had she heard something at work? Had somebody made a decision without telling me? I almost laughed at myself for jumping so quickly into speculation, but I could not help it. When people sense that something is being kept from them, curiosity grows very fast. We begin noticing tiny clues everywhere. We read meaning into pauses, tones, and small hesitations that we might otherwise ignore. When I finally called Megan during lunch, she sounded cheerful, which made the situation even more confusing at first. She asked how I was feeling, whether I had fully recovered, and whether I had noticed any changes in the office. Her questions felt casual, but not completely casual. I answered carefully, still trying to understand what was going on. Then she paused for a second, and I could hear a smile in her voice. "So," she said, "nobody has told you yet." The sentence made my heart skip slightly. I immediately sat up straighter in my chair. That was the kind of line that transforms a normal day into something far more interesting. She had definitely revealed that there was information I did not have. Instead of answering quickly, I asked her what she meant. She laughed softly and said she was not supposed to ruin the surprise. That only made me more alert. At that point, my curiosity was fully awake. I wanted to know everything. I wanted to understand why people had been acting strangely. I wanted to know what was being planned, who knew about it, and why it had not reached me yet. Megan kept talking around the subject, which made the whole thing even more suspenseful. She said the news was good, that it involved the team, and that I should just be patient for a few more hours. I could tell she was enjoying my confusion a little, though not in a mean way. It was the kind of playful mystery that makes people lean in closer. By the end of the afternoon, the tension finally became impossible to ignore. Our manager called the entire team into the conference room. The chairs were arranged in a neat circle, and everyone had that unusual expression people get when they are trying not to smile too soon. I could feel that something important was about to be announced. Then the manager looked around the room, cleared his throat, and said we had successfully secured a major new client. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Then the room exploded with excitement. People laughed, clapped, and started talking at once. I finally understood why everyone had seemed so secretive all day. They had been holding back the news until the right moment. The surprise was real, and it was even better than I had imagined. As everyone began celebrating, I thought about how easily my mind had built a whole story from a few small clues. That is the strange power of not knowing. When information is missing, the imagination fills the silence. Sometimes we invent worries that are not true. Sometimes we assume the worst. Sometimes we convince ourselves that something serious is happening when the reality is much simpler and much happier. I had spent much of the day wondering whether people were hiding something negative. In the end, they had been hiding something wonderful. That contrast made the experience unforgettable. After the announcement, people started sharing the details of how the client had been won. Apparently, months of careful preparation had finally paid off. Several team members had worked late into the night refining the proposal. Others had spent hours revising presentations, checking figures, and preparing demonstrations. The information had been kept quiet because the company wanted to make sure everything was confirmed before telling the whole team. Hearing that explanation made complete sense. It also made me realize that secrecy is not always about deception. Sometimes it is about timing. Sometimes people hold back information because they want to share it properly, or because they are trying to protect a surprise, or because they do not want to spread uncertainty before everything is ready. Still, I could not deny that the uncertainty had been uncomfortable. Not knowing the full story had made me restless. That feeling is incredibly human. We like clarity. We like being included. We like understanding what is going on around us. When those things are missing, we naturally start asking questions. And when the answers are not available, our curiosity becomes even stronger. That is why rumors spread so quickly in offices, families, and social groups. People want to complete the picture. They want the missing pieces. They want the truth before the truth is officially revealed. One of my favorite things about observing spoken English is that the language often gives a name to these very human experiences. There are words for excitement, relief, embarrassment, patience, surprise, and even confusion. Each expression captures a small part of how people actually live and react. In real conversation, We rarely speak in perfect, complete sentences. We react emotionally, instinctively, and often quite quickly. That is why casual expressions matter so much. They reflect how people really sound when they are caught in the middle of life. They are not polished. They are not stiff. They are alive. That evening, after the office celebration had wound down, I stopped by a small cafe on my way home. I needed a quiet place to process everything. The city outside was glowing with evening lights, and the air felt cooler than it had earlier in the day. I sat near the window with a cup of tea and watched people moving along the sidewalk.
Some were laughing.
Some were on their phones. Some looked tired after a long day. I thought again about the strange tension I had felt in the morning and how quickly it had transformed once the truth came out. The same unknown that had made me anxious had turned into something joyful the moment it was finally revealed. As I sat there, I remembered other times in life when information had been deliberately kept hidden for a good reason.
Surprise party.
Graduation gifts. Secret birthday plans. Special announcements. Even small things, like a friend pretending not to know your favorite dessert while secretly preparing it for you. In those moments, the hidden information is part of the experience. It creates anticipation. It builds emotion. It makes the final reveal feel stronger. But outside those playful situations, when something important is being kept out of sight, people can become uneasy very quickly. That is why honesty and timing matter so much in communication. The next morning, people at work were still talking excitedly about the new client. The atmosphere had changed completely. What had once felt tense and mysterious now felt energetic and hopeful. Conversations were more open. Smiles appeared more easily. Even the people who had seemed quiet the day before were now full of stories and details. I noticed that when the truth finally came out, the entire mood shifted almost instantly. The hidden thing had not been dangerous at all. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to be shared. And in that moment, everyone understood why silence had been necessary. The waiting, the guessing, and the curiosity all suddenly made sense. Watching the office return to normal over the following days gave me plenty of time to think. The excitement surrounding the new client remained strong, but eventually people settled back into their routines. Meetings continued. Deadlines returned. New challenges appeared. Life moved forward the way it always does. Yet one particular conversation from that week stayed in my mind. It happened during a lunch break when several coworkers were discussing business ideas, career goals, and future plans. The conversation was full of enthusiasm. Everyone seemed to have a vision for something they wanted to accomplish. Then one senior manager smiled and said something I never forgot. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Ideas are a dime a dozen. Execution is what matters." At the time, I understood the general meaning, but the phrase immediately caught my attention. A dime is a small American coin worth 10 cents. A dozen means 12 of something. Put together, the expression literally suggests that you can get 12 of something for only a dime, which implies that the item is extremely common and not particularly valuable. In everyday English, when people say something is a dime a dozen, they mean it is easy to find, ordinary, and far from rare. The phrase often appears when people want to remind others that true value comes from quality, effort, or results rather than mere availability. The more I thought about that manager's comment, the more I realized how accurate it was. Every day, people come up with ideas. Some ideas are good. Some are bad. Some are brilliant. Yet having an idea alone is not unusual. Human beings generate thoughts constantly. What separates extraordinary results from ordinary conversations is the willingness to take action. That distinction became clearer and clearer throughout my career. A few months after that lunch conversation, I attended an entrepreneurship conference where hundreds of aspiring business owners gathered to share experiences. During networking sessions, people enthusiastically described products they wanted to create, companies they hoped to launch, and markets they planned to enter. The energy was inspiring. Yet I noticed something interesting. Many attendees were discussing ideas they had been talking about for years. They were still planning, still brainstorming, still preparing to begin. Meanwhile, a handful of people had already started building their projects. Their ideas were not always more innovative. In some cases, their concepts were actually simpler. The difference was that they had taken action. They had made mistakes. They had learned lessons. Listening to their stories reminded me again that ideas themselves are often a dime a dozen. Persistence is much rarer. One entrepreneur shared a story about launching a small online business. When she first introduced the concept to friends, several people told her they had thought of something similar. Others explained how they had once planned to start the same kind of company. She smiled and said, "The funny thing is that none of them actually did it." The audience laughed because everyone understood the truth behind her observation. Many people imagine success. Far fewer commit to the long process required to achieve it. That lesson applies far beyond business. I have seen it in language learning as well. Over the years, countless people have told me they want to speak English fluently. They buy books. They watch videos. They make plans. They create study schedules. They talk about what they are going to do someday. Unfortunately, many never develop consistent habits. They wait for the perfect course, the perfect teacher, the perfect opportunity, or the perfect moment to begin. Meanwhile, other learners quietly study every day. They practice listening while commuting. They review vocabulary before bed. They make mistakes without embarrassment. They keep going even when progress feels slow. Months later, those learners are the ones holding conversations confidently. Their success rarely comes from possessing secret knowledge. More often, it comes from discipline. The desire to learn English is a dime a dozen. Consistent action is what creates results. I remember meeting a student named Kevin several years ago. When we first met, his English was fairly basic. He often struggled to express complex thoughts. However, he had one quality that immediately stood out. He showed up every day. Rain or shine, good mood or bad mood, busy schedule or free schedule, he practiced consistently. Some days he studied for only 30 minutes. Other days he spent several hours learning. The exact amount of time varied, but his commitment never disappeared. Several of his friends began studying at the same time. They all talked about becoming fluent. They all downloaded learning apps. They all created ambitious goals. Yet after a few months, most of them gradually stopped practicing. Life became busy. Motivation faded. Other priorities appeared. Kevin continued. A year later, his progress was remarkable. Watching him succeed reinforced a principle I had encountered repeatedly. Ambition is common. Commitment is rare. Another example appeared during a community fitness challenge I joined one summer. Hundreds of people signed up with enthusiasm. Everyone wanted to become healthier. Everyone talked about exercising regularly. During the first week, attendance was excellent. During the second week, participation dropped slightly. By the third week, many people had disappeared entirely. The challenge itself had not changed. The difference was that enthusiasm had started fading, and discipline was required to continue. The participants who stayed committed experienced noticeable improvements. They became stronger. Their energy levels increased. Their confidence grew. Once again, I observed the same pattern. The desire for positive change was a dime a dozen. The willingness to continue after the initial excitement disappeared was far more valuable. One of the reasons I appreciate the phrase a dime a dozen is that it encourages realism. Modern culture often celebrates inspiration. Inspirational messages certainly have value. They can motivate people to begin. However, inspiration alone rarely produces long-term results. Lasting achievement usually requires repetition, patience, and resilience. The phrase reminds us not to confuse intention with accomplishment. I noticed this principle while volunteering at a local community center. Every year, people proposed dozens of ideas for improving programs and attracting more participants. Some suggestions were excellent. Others were less practical. Yet, regardless of their quality, most ideas remained ideas. The projects that actually transformed the organization were the ones supported by individuals willing to invest time and effort. The people who consistently showed up created the greatest impact. Years later, when I reflected on successful individuals I had met, a pattern emerged. Most were not dramatically more talented than everyone around them. Many were not the smartest people in the room. What distinguished them was persistence. They continued working when progress was slow. They continued learning after making mistakes. They continued showing up after setbacks. Their consistency turned ordinary opportunities into extraordinary outcomes. One evening, I was having dinner with a retired business owner who had built a successful company over several decades. Naturally, I asked him what advice he would give younger professionals. He smiled, took a sip of coffee, and shared a simple observation. He said that nearly everyone he met had ideas. Many people also had talent. What separated the most successful individuals, in his experience, was reliability. They did what they said they would do. They followed through. They kept promises to themselves and others. His words stayed with me because they connected perfectly with everything I had observed. Great intentions are common. Extraordinary follow-through is not. In many ways, reliability has become a competitive advantage precisely because it is less common than people assume. As the years passed, I started noticing how often society overvalues novelty. People constantly search for the next big thing, the newest strategy, the latest trend, the most exciting shortcut. Yet many meaningful achievements are built on surprisingly simple principles. Practice regularly. Show up consistently. Learn from mistakes.
Treat people well.
Continue moving forward. None of those ideas are revolutionary. In fact, most are a dime a dozen. The challenge lies in applying them day after day. That realization changed how I approached my own goals. Instead of obsessing over perfect plans, I focused more on sustainable habits. Instead of waiting for ideal circumstances, I worked with the circumstances available. Instead of chasing constant motivation, I tried to develop consistency. The results were not immediate, but they accumulated steadily over time. One rainy afternoon, I found myself reviewing old journals and notes from previous years. As I turned the pages, I discovered dozens of goals I had written down long ago. Some had been achieved. Others had not. What interested me most was the difference between the two groups. The successful goals were rarely the most exciting. They were usually connected to habits I practiced repeatedly. The abandoned goals often remained trapped at the idea stage. Seeing that pattern in my own life was both humbling and enlightening. Eventually, I came to view the phrase a dime a dozen not as a criticism, but as a reminder. The world contains endless ideas, endless opinions, endless plans, and endless promises. Those things are abundant. What remains rare is the person who transforms knowledge into action. The person who continues learning after the excitement fades. The person who practices consistently enough for new skills to become natural habits. That realization felt especially meaningful when I thought about language learning. Every day, millions of people encounter English phrases online. They save vocabulary lists. They watch lessons. They collect resources. Information has never been more available than it is today. In many ways, English learning materials themselves are a dime a dozen. They exist everywhere. Yet the learner who repeatedly listens, speaks, practices, and applies what they learn becomes something far less common. As I sat reflecting on that idea, I thought about all the expressions that had gradually become part of my own speech over the years. None of them felt natural the first time I heard them. Every phrase required repetition. Every improvement required patience. Fluency did not arrive through inspiration alone. It emerged through consistent practice, small corrections, and countless ordinary moments that accumulated into something meaningful. And the more I thought about that process, the more I realized that true progress rarely comes from discovering one magical phrase. It comes from returning to useful expressions again and again until they become part of who you are, until speaking them feels as natural as breathing, and until the language that once felt foreign begins to sound like your own voice. Congratulations on making it to the end of this lesson. Every English phrase you've learned today is something native speakers use in real life, but knowledge alone isn't enough. The real difference comes from listening, repeating, and using these expressions until they become your natural reflex. If you enjoyed this lesson and want to improve your English listening, vocabulary, and speaking skills every day, make sure to subscribe to Easy Listening English and turn on notifications so you never miss a new lesson. Thank you for listening, keep practicing, keep believing in your progress, and I'll see you in the next lesson.